Eunice, Jen, and I'm excited to talk to you about our work in defining hypothesis formalization. The curiosity that inspired this work was this very simple question of how do researchers author statistical analyses? Specifically, how do they go from research questions and hypotheses to specific statistical model implementations in code? To begin answering this question, we turn to prior work. So prior work at HCI has conducted interview studies with data workers where they've uncovered that data analysis is an iterative process with various different types of analysis alternatives and paths that may be explored. And prior research in statistics has argued for statistical analysis as a sense-making activity, where researchers and analysts are involved in testing and updating their mental models of the world based on insights derived from data. Synthesizing this prior work in HCI and in statistics, we developed this initial model of data analysis praxis, which involves conceptual hypotheses, implicit causal models, the importance of data and observations, and their influence on statistical specifications. In addition, prior research on theories of scientific discovery have posited that scientific discovery exists in four spaces. So this is Schoon and Clar's 1995 model, where there are four spaces or considerations involved in scientific discovery: hypothesis, experiment, paradigm, which includes model implementation, and data representation. There is only a unidirectional arrow from hypothesis to paradigm or model implementations, even though prior work suggests that this diagonal may in fact be bidirectional. So in our research, we connect these two bodies of research on data analysis praxis and theories of scientific discovery, and we extend existing theories to show how hypothesis formalization exists on this diagonal from hypotheses to paradigm, and in fact includes a bidirectional relationship. So we divided our initial motivating question into three specific research questions. First, what is the range of steps an analyst might consider when formalizing their hypotheses? Second, how do analysts think about and perform the steps? And finally, how might current software tools influence hypothesis formalization? Reiterate and emphasize some of the key phases identified in prior research, such as conceptual hypotheses, implicit causal models, and the importance of data. But in addition, our content analysis finds that researchers are very focused on identifying proxy variables for how they measure their concepts. And in fact, they break down their conceptual hypotheses into specific sub-hypotheses. And they iterate on this process in a hypothesis refinement loop. So we have initial evidence for this iterative process involving hypotheses, variables, and sub-hypotheses. In addition, just as prior work has suggested, there's an important relationship between data sets and then statistical model implementations, starting to give us a clue into the dual search nature of hypothesis formalization that not only involves hypotheses and data, but also statistical model implementation. We conducted a lab study to answer our first two research questions and recruited 24 data workers, and the study was broken down into three parts. The motivating question posited to the participants was, what aspects of an individual's background and demographics are associated with income after they have graduated from high school? In the three-part study, we first asked participants to brainstorm hypotheses, conceptual models, statistical specifications in the lab, and then implement these statistical analyses at home, and then come back to the lab in order to reflect on their analysis process, their results, and their experiences. Some key findings from our lab study include a reiteration, as from our content analysis, that researchers focus on proxies and data collection when articulating hypotheses, thinking about surveys or other available data sets, for example. We were also surprised to see just how much participants were fixated on implementation and statistical tools when asked just to specify and discuss their statistical approaches. So, for example, one participant outlined a very detailed list of steps that they would take in order to conduct their statistical test, which is only mentioned at the very end. They include everything from data transformation, wrangling to visualization. In addition, we were really surprised to just see how focused researchers and data analysts were in fitting their current statistical analysis to previous projects and familiar approaches. One participant described how they usually tend to jump into their data and match the analysis problem with similar patterns they've seen in the past and start implementing that after doing some rough diagramming. One researcher went so far as to actually just generate data for the task. So for instance, they described how they really don't like non-normal data, and in their normal practice, they really try to do everything they can, whether it's transforming data, cleaning outliers, etc., to get normal data, just because non-normal data messes their process up so much. Although, generating synthetic data may be acceptable for a lab study, and not something that this researcher does in their normal practice, it nevertheless illustrates just how adherent analysts are to ways that they are familiar with even if they're suboptimal and in fact undermine their current analysis goals. Furthermore, we found that analysts were really focused on, avoiding or resisting stating their assumptions for fear of biasing their analyses. Right? As an illustration, one participant, described how income would plateau after a certain age, yet while another participant described how income would continually monotonically increase with age. Both participants thought this, relationship between age and income was so obvious that they didn't need to, state it, and that in fact by stating it, somehow they would bias their exploration of their data. But nevertheless, right, we have two contradicting views on what happens to income over the course of one's lifespan. When probed a little further, one participant described how it's so easy to run individual tests. You can run hypothesis tests faster than you can actually think of what the hypothesis might be. So there's no need to really presuppose what relationships might exist. Interestingly, right, from the same observation, we might think that because statistical tests are so easy to run, it's more important that we state our assumptions and our hypotheses a priori. This goes to kind of further highlight the importance of both of these searches in hypothesis formalization, which we describe to be a dual search process that involves hypothesis refinement on one end and statistical model implementation iteration on the other, and that this process is really a problem-solving and design process where analysts must, reconcile constraints and considerations that arise from their concepts, their data, statistical methods, and actual implementations. And so we began to kind of probe further into what does that actually mean for how tools are either, supporting or taking away from this process. We focused on four key aspects of tools: their specialization and scope, their model expression, the statistical taxonomies they embodied, as well as the computational control they offered end users. And here I'll just highlight a few key illustrations of our findings. So the first is that specialized tools are really important for creating this diverse ecosystem of statistical methods and tools, but they also come at the cost of pushing computational concerns higher up the hypothesis formalization process. Statistical tools also introduce syntactic and semantic mismatches that could create a rift between model implementations and conceptual hypotheses. The last illustration of this was in ANOVAs, what the sums of squares procedures are. Basically, how is variance partitioned among variables specified. So in the R-stats core package, the default is to use type 1, and in the stats models package, its default is type 2, whereas in SPSS, it's type 3. And these three different sums of squares procedures lead to different F statistics and p-values, which may lead analysts to different conclusions. But more importantly than that, they actually test very different conceptual hypotheses. Furthermore, we found that tools require analysts to match their conceptual hypotheses with tools' taxonomies, which can be idiosyncratic. And in fact, we often found misalignment and inconsistencies between these taxonomies. These low-level control knobs that these tools provide end users, such as specifying the number of threads or specifying the number of CPUs to run on, are helpful, but they also lack feedback. So for example, analysts can easily change parameters to fine-tune their settings, but then this might actually require conceptual revisions that introduce this gulf of evaluation. So this goes to further emphasize just how important this dual search process is, right? And how the current tooling ecosystem is really focused on this lower portion of hypothesis formalization, even though end users really care about their concepts and all of the things that lead up to that point. So how might we go about bridging these gulfs? So based on our observations, we derived two design implications for tools. The first is around high-level abstractions. So tools should provide higher-level abstractions for expressing model implementation intents. Right? Higher levels of abstraction themselves are not enough, but they must also be coupled with computational assistance that, for example, might include more generic interfaces for libraries with all slightly different modeling syntaxes. So we connect model implementations with mathematical equations and show and underscore some of the statistical similarity between seemingly different methods, such as the ANOVA and linear mixed effects model. Or another opportunity for high-level abstractions is to allow end users to more directly express their conceptual hypotheses and then to bootstrap the model implementation process. A second implication of our work is to really focus on co-authoring conceptual and statistical models, rather than focusing end users on statistical models and expecting them to do all of the work a priori to get to a specific statistical specification. How can we urge our tools to consider this entire process end to end? Thank you for your attention.